In the heart of the winter of 1883, the blizzard raged, sweeping across the frozen wilderness with unforgiving fury. But one prospector, alone in the wilds of Montana, found himself warm, too warm, while the storm raged outside. How did he defy nature's wrath, with only a simple tent and a quiet ingenuity? Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if tales of survival in the wild move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will reveal another legend of the frontier. The snow came in sideways, as if the mountains themselves had conspired to bury the earth beneath an unyielding white blanket. Gusts of wind whipped through the trees, and the temperature dropped far below freezing. To most, the storm was a death sentence, the kind of storm that could freeze a man where he stood, the kind that could rip tents apart and swallow whole camps. But for Jacob Blackwood, it was a test of the windproof tent he had crafted with his own hands, a test that would determine whether his creation was truly as life-saving as he believed. Jacob stood outside his camp, his eyes narrowing against the wind, scanning the snow-covered horizon. The tent he had spent months perfecting stood steadfast behind him, its heavy canvas flapping in the gusts, but showing no signs of surrender. The roaring wind, laden with ice and snow, slammed into the walls of the tent, but it didn't penetrate. Inside, a small fire crackled away, the warmth of the flames reflecting off the thick, weathered fabric. The blizzard in 1883 had been the worst Jacob had seen in his 10 years of prospecting. He knew it would take a miracle to survive if he didn't have a shelter that could stand up to the relentless assault. For weeks, he'd carefully constructed the design of his tent, sourcing hides, canvas, and every trick he could glean from frontier survival knowledge. The result? A structure designed to trap heat, reject wind, and hold firm against the ferocity of a storm. As he stood there, barely able to hear his own thoughts over the howl of the storm, Jacob realized that this was more than just shelter, it was life itself. The first test had begun, and he hoped with every fiber of his being that his ingenuity would hold out against nature's wrath. Jacob's hands were numb from the cold as he sealed the door of the tent with the final layer of thick leather. He had learned early on that the smallest gaps, the tiniest drafts, could turn a warm shelter into a freezing tomb. He had crafted his shelter to perfection, reinforced the seams with waxed twine, and even placed small vents near the floor for air circulation. But his most ingenious creation lay in the inner lining of the tent. Using scraps of fur he had gathered from his earlier hunts, Jacob fashioned a layer of insulation that would trap the body heat inside, keeping the interior warmer than the harsh exterior. Inside the tent, his breath came out in visible clouds, but it was far less freezing than the biting cold outside. Jacob sat near the fire, his body aching from the long days of preparation, but grateful for the warmth that surrounded him. He knew the storm would test him in ways he couldn't predict, but he felt confident in his shelter. He had no choice but to believe in it, for there was no turning back now. Outside, the snow piled higher by the minute. The sound of the wind was deafening, the snow now rising in drifts that swallowed the campfire and threatened to fill every crack in the shelter. But Jacob's tent remained standing tall, its structure solid and unyielding. He checked his supplies, salted meat, some dried roots, and a couple of bottles of whiskey he had no intentions of needing any more, for the storm showed no signs of stopping. As the hours passed, the temperature continued to plummet. His fingers, now frozen in place from their previous work, began to lose feeling, but the warmth inside the tent held steady. By his estimation, it was at least 40 degrees warmer in here than outside. The storm could rage, and the winds could howl, but Jacob had a small victory already: survival. His hope now was that his creation would hold up for the long haul. The storm could last for days, and he needed every inch of warmth he could get to make it through. He didn't know it yet, but this simple tent, built from his own experience and with his own hands, would change the way people survived in the frontier forever. The storm didn't let up. It howled relentlessly through the night, battering against the tent as though it was trying to tear it to pieces. Jacob had heard stories of blizzards that lasted for days, even weeks, but he'd never experienced one this ferocious. The wind was unlike anything he'd felt before. It whipped across the land in violent gusts, each one colder than the last, making the snow seem as sharp as knives. Yet, As the hours dragged on, Jacob found himself oddly comfortable. He could hear the storm outside, but inside, the fire still burned, and the temperature remained bearable. The fire in the center of the tent crackled, sending out warm pulses of heat, and Jacob could see his breath when he exhaled, but it didn't freeze. It wasn't the stifling heat of a summer night, no, it was the warmth that kept the worst of the cold at bay, the kind of warmth that allowed him to sleep without shivering. The fact that the shelter had held up this long gave him a sense of hope, but the reality of the situation weighed heavily on him. His rations were limited, though he had stored enough to survive a couple of weeks. His legs ached from sitting, but Jacob dared not leave the tent, not with the storm pressing so hard against the door. His mind wandered to thoughts of his family back home and what they would think if they knew how desperate the situation had become. He had come to Montana to stake his claim, to dig for gold, to build a life in the wilderness. But this storm was the true test of his spirit, and right now, his survival depended entirely on the tent he had created. Outside, the snow was piling up fast. The howling winds blew flurries across the landscape, each gust heavier than the last. Jacob could feel the pressure mounting. The storm was relentless, unyielding, but his tent was standing firm, a lone island in the frozen wasteland. The test of endurance wasn't just about the shelter anymore, but about his mental resolve. Would the shelter hold up through the second night? Would the cold ever creep in, or would his solution prove itself for good? With a deep breath, Jacob took another sip of whiskey to settle his nerves, trying to ignore the unsettling groaning of the tent as the wind pushed harder against it. His mind raced, but he refused to entertain the thought of failure. He had worked too hard. This tent was his ticket to survival, and as the storm continued to rage, Jacob believed it would carry him through. The second night in the blizzard came with a new intensity. The wind had shifted, howling at the walls of the tent like a wild animal trying to claw its way inside. Jacob lay on his bedroll, staring up at the roof of his shelter, listening to the harsh cries of the storm. It was a haunting sound, as if the world itself was breaking apart. Yet inside the tent, he felt a strange sense of peace. The warmth from the fire, combined with the insulation of his fur-lined walls, kept the freezing cold outside at bay. But survival was never as simple as just keeping warm. Jacob knew that. The isolation was starting to take its toll, and the weight of his solitude was pressing down on him. He missed the sounds of people, the small comforts of a world beyond the wilderness. Here, alone, in the midst of a violent storm, it felt as though the very earth had forgotten him. The storm had already been raging for 2 days, and Jacob had no idea how much longer it would last. There was a certain bleakness in the silence between the howling winds, a reminder that in the wilderness no one was coming to help. No one was checking in. No one could hear his cries for assistance. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Snow continued to pile up, the wind driving the flakes in every direction, making it impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the tent's walls. Jacob had no idea how deep the snow had become, but he had a sinking feeling that it was only a matter of time before the situation became truly dire. He could survive this storm, but could his shelter survive the test of time? Every creak and groan of the tent felt like a reminder of the battle he was facing. The cold was constant, gnawing at his bones. He had managed to secure his fire and conserve his supplies, but Jacob's mind began to wander again. What if the wind tore the tent apart? What if the snow piled up so high that he couldn't escape? There were so many unknowns in the wilderness, so many dangers that couldn't be predicted. But then he took a deep breath, focusing on the fire, on the warmth. He reminded himself of why he had built this tent, why he had labored over it for so long. The tent had kept him alive this long. It had withstood the worst of the storm's fury, and Jacob had to believe it would continue to do so. This shelter wasn't just his refuge, it was the product of his blood, sweat, and every ounce of survival instinct he had. The price of survival had been paid in effort, in isolation, and in a deep, aching need to escape the harsh realities of the wild. Jacob Blackwood knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up now. No matter how hard the storm pushed, no matter how lonely or desperate the days became, his shelter would hold. And as long as that fire burned, so would he. Jacob awoke to silence, a stark contrast to the howling winds he had come to expect. The storm had quieted, but its impact remained. The snow outside had piled high, almost burying the tent. The once open expanse of wilderness now seemed like a dense, suffocating white world. There were no sounds of wildlife, no movement. Only the soft crunch of snow as the wind stirred, sending occasional drifts against the tent. Inside, the warmth of the fire flickered weakly. Jacob sat up slowly, his muscles stiff from days of sitting idle. His eyes scanned the tent's interior. The dim glow from the fire cast long shadows on the walls, accentuating the strain the shelter had endured. It was still holding strong, but the quiet was unnerving. Jacob moved to the door of the tent and pushed the heavy leather aside. The cold air hit him like a slap, but he had grown accustomed to it. Stepping outside, he immediately felt the vastness of the snowstorm's wrath. The snow was so deep now that he could barely make out his own footsteps from the previous days. A near whiteout had swallowed the landscape. His heart sank as he took in the scene. The ground had frozen solid beneath the snow, and everything seemed lifeless, as if the world had gone to sleep and forgotten to wake up. It had been days since he last saw daylight, and the lack of contact with the outside world began to wear on him. There was a growing weight inside him, the gnawing feeling of isolation that no shelter, no matter how well built, could truly protect him from. Out here, he was alone. Alone in a world that was determined to break him, to claim him. He had survived this far, but the storm had brought with it a creeping doubt that he couldn't shake. Could the tent keep him safe for much longer? What if the wind came back with even more ferocity? What if his supplies ran out before the storm did? The terror of uncertainty clawed at him. His hands trembled as he gazed at the harsh wilderness around him, feeling the crushing weight of nature's indifference. The fire inside the tent had been a small comfort, but the cold was starting to creep in. Jacob could feel it in his bones. For a brief moment, he considered abandoning the shelter altogether, braving the storm, trying to find his way out. But the memory of the blizzard's fury, the cold that gnawed at the very marrow of his bones, kept him rooted. He had created this shelter to withstand such odds, and now it was his only chance of survival. He turned back toward the tent, slowly, as though the weight of the decision was pressing down on him. He had built this tent with his own hands, and it had stood firm through the storm's worst. Could he trust it to protect him for the days ahead? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but deep down he knew the answer. As long as the tent stood, he would stay. His will, as much as the tent itself, was what would carry him through. By the time Jacob returned to the warmth of the tent, the storm had settled into a steady, relentless rhythm. The howling winds had ceased, but the snow kept falling, thick and heavy, a Prospector Bradeheim 7-7-2 white wall that shut him off from the outside world. The temperature had dropped even further, and the fire inside the tent burned brighter, as though it too was struggling against the endless cold. Jacob sat by the fire, wrapping his arms tightly around his chest to ward off the cold. His thoughts raced, jumping from the fear of his isolation to the uneasy comfort his shelter had provided so far. The warmth of the fire was a lifeline, but it seemed as if every moment the storm was trying to tear that life away. As he sat, he heard something, a faint sound, almost imperceptible at first. Then it grew louder, unmistakable. The crunching of snow under heavy footsteps. His heart leapt in his chest. He knew what it was, a bear. It was no surprise. The wilderness was full of them, and they had a keen instinct for finding shelter during a storm. But the fact that the bear was this close to his tent, it filled Jacob with a sense of urgency. He grabbed his rifle, his hands steady, despite the rising panic in his chest. The wind had done little to mask the scent of food in his camp, and the bear was surely drawn to the warmth. The cabin had kept the beast at bay once before, but now, with his supplies running low and the storm trapping him in place, Jacob wasn't sure what to expect. He peered out through a small gap in the tent, hoping to get a glimpse of the creature. The wind had pushed the snow into deep drifts around the shelter, and visibility was almost non-existent. He couldn't see it yet, but he could hear it. The bear was circling, testing the perimeter of his camp, looking for a way in. Jacob's breath came in sharp bursts as his grip tightened on his rifle. The fear of the creature, combined with the dread of the unknown, sent a chill deeper than the cold ever could. Then, a loud thud. The bear was at the door. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct told him to act quickly, but he knew he had to be patient. If the bear tried to break in, he would have to be ready. He felt the weight of every decision, knowing that in this world, one misstep could be the difference between life and death. The bear scraped at the door, sniffing and growling in frustration. Jacob knew this moment could define his survival. If the shelter held, it would save him. If it failed, well, he wasn't ready to face that thought yet. The bear moved away, and Jacob let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It was a temporary reprieve, but it confirmed something he had feared. He was not as safe as he'd believed. The storm raged on outside, the blizzard unforgiving. But inside his shelter, Jacob Blackwood's fight for survival had only just begun. The days blurred together as the storm showed no signs of stopping. Jacob had learned to pace himself, managing his rations and firewood carefully. The harsh winds continued to howl, lashing against the tent, a constant reminder of the dangers that lay outside. The first few days had been a test of endurance, but as the storm persisted, the mental weight of solitude began to settle heavily on Jacob's mind. The isolation was a silent predator, always lurking, creeping into the corners of his thoughts. The wind outside, while fierce, was no match for the creeping loneliness that gnawed at his soul. Days felt like weeks. Every time Jacob glanced at his dwindling supplies or the pile of firewood stacked by the door, the same thought echoed in his mind. What if the storm never ends? What if he was trapped here forever, alone in the wilderness? Each night, as he lay in the dim light of the fire, he thought about the world beyond the snowdrifts. He thought about the days when he'd been among people, when the sounds of laughter filled the air, and he didn't have to worry about survival every single moment of his waking hours. He thought about the life he had left behind, the people who wouldn't even know if he had perished out here. Jacob had always prided himself on his independence, his ability to endure the harshest of conditions. But now, faced with this endless storm, the weight of isolation was beginning to erode his resolve. What was the point of surviving if there was no one to share it with? The idea of dying alone in this bleak wilderness with only the roar of the wind for company seemed like a fate worse than the cold itself. But the fire still burned in the center of the tent, and the shelter still stood strong. He had come too far to give up now. He refused to let the storm, or his own mind, break him. The tent had proven its worth, and he would not let the suffocating silence of solitude be the thing that took him down. Jacob rose from his spot by the fire and moved to the door, his boots crunching in the snow as he stood on the threshold of the shelter. He stared out into the swirling white wilderness, the vastness of the storm stretching as far as his eyes could see. The snow had formed a deep wall around his tent, isolating him further from the rest of the world. But despite the crushing weight of solitude, he felt a flicker of resolve. He had come to the wilderness to prove something to himself, to stake his claim in the mountains, to carve out a life in a place where survival was never guaranteed. The storm had tested him, but it had also shown him something deeper, his own strength. As long as the tent stood, as long as the fire burned, he would continue to fight. And then, in the dead of night, something shifted. The storm, which had been relentless, began to taper off. The winds died down. The snow slowed to a soft, almost peaceful fall. The silence outside, which had once been deafening, now seemed to be a reprieve. Jacob sat by the fire, exhausted but at peace, for the first time in days. The storm had taken everything it could, but it had left him with one thing, a chance. It was still too early to know if the worst had passed, but for the first time since the blizzard had started, Jacob allowed himself to relax. He closed his eyes and let the warmth of the fire seep into his bones, a small but vital reminder that he was alive. And that, for now, was enough. The dawn came slowly, light piercing through the snow clouds like a promise of something more. Jacob woke to the scent of smoke and the soft crackle of the fire still burning. For the first time in days, he felt the weight of exhaustion lift slightly. The storm, which had raged for so long, seemed to be letting up a thin sliver of daylight cutting through the gray sky, signaling that the worst might be over. But as Jacob crawled out of his bedroll and stretched stiff muscles, the air felt different. The calm after the storm was deceiving, and deep down, Jacob knew that nature would never fully release its grip. He had survived the worst of the cold, but now, the reality of the situation settled in. He was still trapped. The snow outside was waist-deep, and the storm had buried the landscape in a thick, unyielding layer of ice and frost. Jacob made his way to the door of the tent and pushed the leather aside, stepping out into the white abyss. The world before him was unrecognizable. His tracks, the ones he had made during the storm, were completely covered by fresh snow. The snowstorm had erased every trace of his presence. For a moment, Jacob stood there, unsure of what to do next. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, and the silence of the wilderness pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. It felt as if he had been swallowed whole by the mountains, lost in a place where time didn't exist, where nothing beyond the shelter mattered. But survival had never been about comfort or certainty. It was about enduring, adapting, and finding strength even in the most desperate of circumstances. Jacob turned back to the tent, his eyes scanning the structure that had kept him alive. The walls were holding firm, the canvas stretched taut against the weight of the snow that had accumulated on top. But as he looked closer, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. A section of the tent near the base had begun to sag. The snow was too heavy, too relentless, and it was pushing the fabric down, threatening to collapse the shelter entirely. The wind had died down, but the damage had already been done. In that moment, Jacob knew he was facing a new danger, one he couldn't ignore. The tent, which had been his savior, was now a potential trap. If the snow continued to build on the roof, the entire structure could cave in, burying him alive. The fire would go out. The warmth would dissipate, and he would be left exposed to the elements with nowhere to go. His thoughts raced as he looked around, calculating his next move. The storm had already pushed him to the brink, but now, with his shelter on the verge of collapse, Jacob had to act fast. He couldn't wait for help, and there would be no more chances. He had to make a decision, stay and risk, being trapped or take his chances in the open wilderness. Jacob took a deep breath and, with grim resolve, made his choice. He couldn't afford to let the storm defeat him now. The storm might have tested his will, but he wouldn't let it take everything from him. He would fight until the last breath. But to do that, he needed to secure his shelter and keep the fire alive no matter what it took. Grabbing his tools, he made his way to the back of the tent, ready to do whatever was necessary to save himself. It was the breaking point, the moment of truth, and Jacob Blackwood wasn't ready to give up just yet. Jacob worked furiously, his hands raw from the cold and the strain of the hours spent digging through the heavy snow. The sagging section of the tent was becoming more dangerous by the minute. Every time he shoveled away a little more of the snow that had accumulated on the roof, more seemed to take its place. He knew he was running out of time. His breath came in ragged bursts as he crouched beneath the canvas, lifting handfuls of snow and hurling them aside. The cold had settled deep into his bones, but his mind stayed sharp, focused on the task at hand. The fire inside was still burning, but its warmth was now a distant memory, muffled by the growing weight of the storm outside. Jacob had built this shelter with everything he had, pouring his heart and soul into every log, every nail, every layer of insulation. He had fought the wilderness for months and survived through sheer will. But now, he wasn't just fighting the elements, he was fighting time itself. The roof, heavy with snow, threatened to collapse with every gust of wind, and the walls seemed to groan under the strain. He paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow, even though the air was biting cold. A deep weariness threatened to overtake him, but Jacob couldn't afford to give in. His hands were shaking, his muscles burning with exhaustion, but he kept going, determined to save what he could. With a grunt, he climbed atop the snow pile and reached for the ropes and poles he had used to reinforce the structure. Slowly, carefully, he began to brace the sagging sections of the tent, pushing against the weight of the snow with all his strength. His muscles screamed in protest, but he refused to stop. This shelter, this creation of his own hands, had kept him alive through the worst of the storm. He wouldn't let it fail now. The storm's fury continued to rage, but Jacob's resolve burned brighter. He wasn't going to let the wilderness take him down. Not yet. Not after everything he had fought for. After what felt like hours, Jacob finally finished reinforcing the structure, securing the roof and walls with makeshift braces. As he stepped back to survey his work, he could feel a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. The worst had passed, at least for now. The tent had held, and Jacob had lived to fight another day. The storm had finally begun to wane, leaving behind a strange stillness in its wake. The snow had stopped falling, and the wind, once a howling beast, now only whispered across the landscape. Jacob stood at the edge of his camp, the light of the setting sun casting a soft golden hue over the snow. His body ached with exhaustion, but his heart felt lighter than it had in days. He had made it through. The shelter, despite its close call, had held firm, and the worst of the storm was finally over. Jacob took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp, cold air. The wilderness, though harsh and unforgiving, had shown him something: the power of persistence. He had fought the storm, and it had not broken him. As the sun sank lower behind the mountains, Jacob gathered his remaining supplies and returned to the tent. Inside, the fire still burned, its warmth a welcome comfort after the days of bitter cold. He pulled his bedroll closer to the hearth, savoring the heat. The worst was over, but survival was a constant challenge, one that would never truly end. Looking out at the vast, silent landscape, Jacob realized that the storm was only one of many tests he would face in this wilderness. But for now, he had won. The tent, built with his own hands, had been the key to his survival, and it had proved its worth beyond measure. The last light of the day bathed the camp in a soft glow, and Jacob, exhausted but resolute, finally allowed himself to rest. As he lay in the warmth of the fire, the wilderness outside quiet and calm, he knew that, no matter what came next, he had the strength to face it. In that moment, Jacob Blackwood understood what true survival meant: not just enduring the storm, but finding the will to push through, even when every part of you wants to give in. The wilderness could be cruel, but it could also be beautiful. And as the stars began to twinkle above, Jacob realized that he had, at least for now, earned his place in it.